There's a line from the 1980s pop song Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads that gets me every time. The singer, David Byrne, suddenly wakes up to the life he's been living and says, "How did I get here?" And then the realization hits him. This is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife. It's a moment of epiphany. He suddenly realizes the life he's living doesn't quite match the one he imagined building. But this isn't just a line from an iconic pop song. It's a moment that shows up for leaders more often than we talk about. Sometimes it happens when a leader looks at the organization they're leading and realizes it doesn't quite resemble what they originally set out to create. Other times it shows up when leaders look at their progress and realize they're much farther from the mission than they expected to be by now. And occasionally, it's even more disorienting than that. A leader looks around and realizes they're responsible for an organization they barely recognize anymore. They've drifted. Over time, motion replaced the clarity that used to guide the work. Goals became more aggressive. Initiatives multiplied. New opportunities drew attention. Momentum carried things forward and fast. And somewhere along the way, the original vision and mission became harder to see and harder to steward. Now here's an interesting question. When a master distiller opens a barrel of aging whiskey years after it was first filled, do they ever stop and ask, how did we get here? The answer is a pretty clear no. Because long before the whiskey even entered the barrel, the distiller already knew what they were trying to create. And there's a lot we can learn from that. Here's something fascinating about the way great whiskey is made. Distillers don't start with the process. They start with the outcome. Long before whiskey ever enters a barrel, the distiller already has a clear picture of what they're trying to create. They know the kind of whiskey they want that bottle to become. Is it bold and full-bodied, light and approachable, complex with layers that unfold over time? That end vision shapes every single decision the distiller makes. The mash bill, the mix of grains that form the foundation of the whiskey, the type of still used to distill it, the barrels that will hold the whiskey as it ages, even where those barrels sit in the rickhouse and how long they have to age. It all must align with the distiller's vision of the whiskey they are trying to create. No decision is ever random. Every one is guided by the same question. What are we trying to create? The distiller starts with the end in mind and then works backwards. Every step of the process is carefully crafted because it moves the spirit closer to that intended outcome. That's why when a distiller opens a barrel years later, they're not surprised by what they find. They expected it because the end shaped the journey from the very beginning, guiding every person, every process, and every decision along the way. Unfortunately, unlike distillers, most leaders don't have the luxury of starting at the beginning of the process. They usually step into the middle of it. Some are brought in to fix the organization that has lost its way. Others are hired to accelerate growth. Some inherit something healthy and are asked to steward what's already working, to maintain the momentum and trajectory. And even founders, who technically start at the beginning, eventually find themselves leading an organization that has grown far beyond its original shape. In other words, leaders rarely start with a clean slate. They start mid-process. But no matter where a leader begins, the end principle still holds. They still need to have the end clearly in mind. In whiskey making, one of the earliest and most important decisions a distiller makes is the mash bill. The mash bill is the carefully crafted mix of grains that forms the foundation of the whiskey. For distillers, those ingredients are things like corn, rye, wheat, malted barley. Each grain contributes something different to the spirit. Flavor, texture, structure. Distillers don't just throw ingredients together and hope for the best. They carefully source and curate the mash bill based on the outcome they're trying to create, the character of the whiskey itself. Leadership has its own version of a mash bill. It's the people, the culture, the systems, the resources, the priorities that shape the organization. And just like a distiller refining the mash bill, leaders often need to adjust what's in the mix if they want the organization to become what it was meant to be. Sometimes that means bringing in new people. Sometimes it means moving people into roles where they can thrive. And sometimes it means letting certain things go. Because if the foundation doesn't align with the end you're trying to create, teams begin chasing the wrong things. Organizations start saying one thing and doing another. Strategy becomes something that's selectively referenced, or even worse, ignored. And eventually, someone looks around and asks the same question we started with. How did we get here? But when a leader starts with the end in mind, they begin shaping the organization with the same intentionality a distiller uses when crafting a whiskey. Because the foundation always determines what the spirit will become. But there's something else that happens when a leader starts thinking about the end. At first, that clarity helps the leader align the organization. It sharpens the mission. It helps leaders align and motivate their people. It brings focus to the strategy and the resources required to pursue it. When the end is clear, when the mission and the impact the organization was built to make are clearly in view, it becomes easier to see what belongs in the mix and what doesn't. But eventually the question doesn't stay focused on the organization. It begins to turn inward. Because the same principle that guides the distiller also applies to you and I. The distiller knows what that bottle was meant to become. That clarity shapes every decision along the way. Everything aligns to what the whiskey was built for. And at some point, we begin asking a similar question about ourselves. Not just what are we building as an organization, but something deeper. Is what I'm leading aligned with what I was built for? Leadership isn't just about building something successful. It's about stewarding something meaningful in a way that reflects who you were created to be. Let me be clear on this. This isn't about walking away from work, and it isn't about abandoning the organization. In fact, in many cases, it means just the opposite. It means stepping more fully into the responsibility of leadership with greater clarity about who you are and how you are meant to lead. The organization has a mission it was built to serve. In fact, it's probably written somewhere in the office. But the leader also has a purpose they were built to steward. When those two things begin to align, leadership stops feeling like a constant pressure and starts feeling more like true stewardship. And that's the moment when the tension we talk about here becomes visible. That tension between what we built and what we're built for. And when that alignment begins to take shape, something else becomes clearer too. Just like the distiller refining the spirit, leaders begin to see what no longer belongs. And that's where the metaphor of whiskey distillation becomes so powerful for leadership. Distillation isn't about adding anything else. It's about removing what doesn't belong. When whiskey is distilled, the goal isn't simply to move the liquid through a still. The goal is to separate the spirit from everything that would dilute it or distort its character. That process involves heat and pressure. The elements of the mixture begin to separate from one another, and the distiller carefully pulls off only the part of the spirit that belongs in the final bottle. Distillation doesn't add a single thing to the mash. It simply removes what doesn't belong. Our leadership should work the same way. When the impact of the organization exists to create becomes clear, when the end is in view, leaders begin to see things differently and more clearly. The initiatives that don't fit, the priorities that no longer align, the opportunities that would only become distractions, those begin to fall away. If they were to stay, they would dilute the spirit of what the organization was built to do. And the same thing begins to happen within the leader. As leaders become clearer about who they were built to be, they begin to see what belongs in their leadership and what doesn't. Certain pressures begin to lose their grip. Certain expectations no longer define their decisions. Certain ambitions that once felt important begin to fade. That's when clarity finally has surfaced. And just like distillation, that clarity comes from removing what doesn't belong. There's a great real-world example of this in the whiskey world. A man named Bill Samuels Sr. was part of a long line of Kentucky distillers. His family had been involved in bourbon for generations. But when he set out to create what eventually became Maker's Mark in the 1950s, he wasn't interested in simply repeating what everyone else was already doing. At the time, many bourbons had a sharp bitterness to them, a strong bite that came from the heavy use of rye in the mash bill. Some drinkers loved the intensity, but Samuels believed that there was a large group of people who wanted something different. So he wanted to create a spirit that was smoother, more approachable, a whiskey people could enjoy without fighting that bitterness. So instead of following tradition, he did something unusual. He removed rye from the mash bill entirely and replaced it with red winter wheat. That single decision changed everything. The wheat softened the flavor. It created a smoother and rounder spirit. And it became the signature profile that Maker's Mark is still known for today. But here's the part that we shouldn't miss. While Bill Samuels replaced one of the ingredients of the mash, he didn't start with the ingredients. He started with the experience he wanted people to have, the impact of the bourbon. Once his vision was clear, every other decision, the mash bill, the distillation, the aging, it all aligned with that outcome. He started with the end in mind. Here's a simple exercise you might want to sit with for a moment. Distillers are constantly asking one very simple question. What kind of whiskey are we trying to create? That question guides everything. The mash bill, the distillation, the aging, every decision they make along the way. Leaders rarely ask the question in the same way, but maybe we should. What kind of organization are we actually trying to create? What kind of impact is it meant to have? And just as important, what kind of leader do we want to be in the process? I'm not talking about the role, not talking about the title, but the person, Because clarity is about what the end looks like, and it has a way of revealing what belongs in the mix and what doesn't. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you usually write down notes about what you experienced, things that stood out, and things you want to remember. Insights you don't want to lose once the moment passes. Here are my tasting notes from today's conversation. Yours might be different. First, leaders and organizations rarely drift because they stop caring. They drift because motion slowly replaces clarity. Goals expand, initiatives multiply, opportunities compete for attention. And over time, the original mission becomes harder to see. Second, great distillers start with the end first, not the process. They begin with the experience they want the whiskey to create. That vision shapes the mash bill, the distillation, the aging, every decision along the way. Leadership should work the same way. When the mission of the organization was built to serve is clearly in view, it becomes easier to see what belongs in the mix and what doesn't. And finally, distillation isn't about adding more. It's about removing what doesn't belong. When clarity about the mission and clarity about who you were built to be as a leader begin to align, something powerful happens. The distractions fall away. The pressures that once defined your leadership lose their grip. And what remains is the spirit of the work you were meant to steward. If you'd like to revisit these ideas later, you can find the full tasting notes for each episode on the Crafted Clarity website. Let's go back to that great line from the Talking Heads. How did I get here? For many leaders, that question shows up as a moment of disorientation, realizing that the organization, the work, or even the leadership journey doesn't quite resemble what they once imagined. But when leaders begin with the end clearly in mind, when the mission and impact the organization was built to create remain in view, and when leaders continue to align their own leadership with who they were built to be, we won't one day wake up and wondering how we got there. We'll know. Thanks for joining me in the tasting room, and remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. Thanks for listening to Crafted Clarity. If you're a leader wrestling with the tension between success and significance, or if you're trying to align your work with a deeper calling, I'd love to connect with you. If your organization is facing questions about strategy, whether it's alignment, ROI, or building confidence in your team, this is the work we do every day at iBrand. And if you walk this journey yourself, or maybe you're right in the middle of it, I'd love to hear your story and maybe even share it here on the podcast. You can find me at craftedclarity.net.